Thank you, and greetings to all of you on this fine evening, and welcome once again to the third session of this series about biblical geography. And as I have been talking about in the past two sessions, this particular series deals with biblical geography and how it shaped the narratives and the growth of spirituality and Christian religiosity. So, for those of you who were not present or not being able to see the past two versions, just a recap of what we had been talking about. So, we began from the cradle of civilization in the Mesopotamian Fertile Crescent, which is encompassed by the four rivers, particularly Euphrates and Tigris. And then we talked about the placement of the Garden of Eden, all the way to Ur of the Chaldeans, from where Abram sets out as part of the commandment of God and the covenant that ensued. Traveling along the established trade routes, such as the King's Highway, the Anatolian Highway, and particularly for our study, the Via Maris, or the Way of the Sea, from Ur through Haran onto Shechem, further down to Egypt, and later back through the Negev, eventually ending up at Hebron, with certain markers along the way, such as the Oak of Mamre. So, to draw our attention into what I am going to be talking about for today, I would like to recap on the last bits of our session from last week. So, we talked about how Jacob sent his son Joseph. And as you can see on the screen in the map that has been shared, right, so Joseph goes from Hebron up to the highlands of Dothan, where his brothers were grazing the cattle, because the highlands were suitable grounds for cattle farming. But then we know that his brothers were filled with jealousy, and then they throw him into a well, and then they later sell him to Ishmaelite or Midianite traders who were traveling along the way of the sea, all the way down to On, or the modern day Heliopolis, which at that time was the center of the sun worship in Egypt, or the sun god Ra in Lower Egypt. And we talked about the Nile Crescent and all its fertile grounds, leading to the growth of the Nile Valley civilization. Now we know that the Nile Valley civilization would have been there growing for several centuries, even several millennia for that fact, prior to the arrival of Joseph in Egypt. It's dated to around 6000 BC to at least 3000 BC, the development of the civilization. Of course, it's not as old as the Mesopotamian civilization, where we talked about the cradle of civilization, which has archaeological records dating all the way back to 10,000 BC. Now, we understand that the time frame of Abraham would be in around roughly 2200 BC. So we're talking of a time period of around 2000 BC or so, or maybe 2100 BC, where Joseph goes to Egypt, and he is based in and around the Nile Valley. Now, particularly considering the Nile Valley, there is always the annual flooding. And at least 1,000 years prior to Joseph's time, the Nile Valley flooding would have been used as a mechanism to transform these low-lying fertile grounds of the Nile Delta into what was later conveniently termed as the breadbasket of Egypt. So the reason why this is important is because this sets the background for Joseph as the vizier or the second in command to the Pharaoh, who would have overseen the maintenance of this extensive system of irrigation channels, which ensured that the waters of the annual Nile flood watered these fields of barley and emmer, the cereals that were grown in Egypt to produce their two greatest staple products, being bread and beer. So the prosperity of the Egyptian Middle Kingdom dependent on the successful management of these Nile floods by the Pharaoh and his vizier, who in our context over here right now is Joseph. So in fact, there is an artificial canal that was built to channel this Nile water that even today is called Bahar Yusuf, or the waterway of Joseph. So you can see how important Joseph being in that Nile fertile ground at this time was. So, reflecting on the Genesis narratives, we read that there were 7 years of good inundations or floods that have been marked by archaeological discoveries of the high water levels. And this would have produced the 7 years of plentiful crops that we read in Genesis. But then again, there is always the danger of catastrophic flood levels that would have swept away the irrigation bunds and destroyed the crops. That would have led to the 7 years of famine that we read in the book of Genesis. Now, that, along with the famine in the land of Canaan, which probably would have been caused out of prolonged absence of rain, it forces Jacob's sons to go into Egypt, and this is around 1800 BC, like I mentioned earlier. And then eventually they settle over there, and they have their descendants grow in numbers over there. And over the years, they grow to an extent where the Egyptians fear them, and eventually they become enslaved. So that leads us into the time frame. Right, that leads us into the time frame of, sorry. Right, that leads us into the time frame of the Exodus from Egypt, which would have been dated around 1400 BC, taking into fact that the Egyptians were in Israel for around 430 years. Now they travel all the way from Egypt, and this is something that we talked about last week, from Egypt through the Sukkot Valley, down through crossing the Red Sea, all the way down to Mount Sinai. I think my reds are getting confused. Right, from Egypt all the way through the Sukkot Valley, down crossing the river, the Red Sea, into the Mount Sinai, and that seems all like a storytelling. But then the fact of the matter is that this harsh and barren environment forces them to rely on God for survival, leading to a deeper understanding of their faith and their dependence on divine provision. So the geographical transition from the wilderness of Sinai and Paran, for that fact, to the fertile grounds of Canaan, of the Jordan Valley, signifies a move from hardship and dependence to abundance and freedom. It is, it can be understood as a symbolic representation of spiritual transformation. So a move from a life of wandering to one of stability and divine fulfillment. So let me move on into more details about today's session. And we began this from where we ended last week with their entry into Canaan. Now we read in Numbers chapter 13, right, as you can see on the screen, when Moses sent them to explore Canaan, and this is talking about the spies that he sent into Canaan, as we read in Numbers chapter 13. He said, go up through the Negev and onto the hill country. See what the land is like and inquire about it. And inquire of the towns, see if they are walled or fortified, if the soil, if it is fertile or poor, if there are trees. So, in essentiality, they are going to inquire about the geographical condition of the land. Now, we know that, as we can read in verse 21, they went up and explored the land from the desert of Zin as far as Rehob toward Lemohamath. The details of that doesn't matter. But then the fact that we have to remember is that they went through the Negev, which is a harsh, barren, arid, desertous, and mountainous land. And it is through this land that they go, and they eventually come upon Canaan, where they see all those fortified cities. But they also see the valley of Eshcol, where there were cultivations enough of clusters of grapes as well as pomegranates and figs. So, as far as people who have been wandering around in the desert for a long, long time, to see an abundance of fruits is undoubtedly something positive. It is even proof that there is indeed a land flowing with milk and honey. But obviously, those Canaanite places with the people and the challenges of the Negev cause a negativity among the spies, particularly the presence of the Amalekites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, and all these people. They cause negativity among the spies. And we read in the following verses that only Caleb and Joshua gave a positive report. And they emphasized on God's ability to deliver the people. So, right. So, moving back into our map once again, the Israelites wandered. Let me put that in a different color so it's convenient. They wandered in the wilderness of Sinai and upward to the wilderness of Paran, traveling along the King's Highway. And they come to Kadesh Barnea, which is where they send the spies out into Canaan. And we talked about the Negev and its presence over there, and that's the arid, barren, mountainous land that they would have to cross, which causes the negativity in them until they reach the land of Canaan. So then they come back to Kadesh Barnea, and that's when Joshua and Caleb encourages them to proceed further. So, as you can see on the screen on the right, and this is as detailed in Numbers chapter 20 and 21, they passaged on through Edom because the Negev was too dry, so they had to move eastward into Edom. But as you can see in verse 20 of chapter 13 of the book of chapter 20 of the book of Numbers, again they answered, you may not pass through. And this is Edom. Right there, Edom. And Edom is the descendants of Esau. And they tell them that you cannot pass through Edom. So if you were to see of it, they could have just avoided the Negev and gone around like that. But Edom created a barrier for them and would not let them through. This results in the Israelites going, as you can read further in verse 21, since Edom refused to let them go through the territory, Israel turned away from them. So they go away from Edom around them, and that causes them to come into the land of Moab. Moab if you are all good in your memories, are descendants of Lot from his daughter, along with the Ammonites, who are descendants of Lot's as well through his other daughter. And obviously, they settle in this particular region for a while. And the reason that is important is because, as we can read further along, they camped in the plains of Moab, and they camped at the Jordan across from Jericho. This is where all the incidents with Balak and the prophet Balaam, etc., take place. Eventually, they move on and they go ahead to capture Sihon, which would be around this area, and also Og at Bashan, right there. All these are east of the river Jordan. And this provided the territory which later was allocated to tribes such as Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, as we will see later. These victories are also highlighted in the Psalms, such as in Psalms 135, the verses that you can see. Sihon, king of the Amorites, Og, king of Bashan, and all the kings of Canaan. And he gave their land as an inheritance to his people Israel. So you can see how the fact that the presence of the Negev causes the Israelites to go eastward, but the presence of the Edomites who blocked their way caused them to go around Edom into the area of Sihon and later towards Bashan. And this even affects King David's writings of the Psalm centuries later. Now, the other reason why this is particularly important is because it is from the influence of Moab and the Ammonites that the Israelites start intermarrying into other communities, into other faiths, into other people, as well as accepting their gods. And a classical example of that would be, as we read in Numbers chapter 25, where we read, as you can see on the left of the screen, an Israelite man brought into the camp a Midianite woman right before the eyes of Moses and the whole assembly of Israel while they were weeping at the entrance to the tent. So all this is events that happen in this particular area of the Moab and Ammonites. That's where the Midianite woman is brought by an Israelite man. And then Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, took a spear in his hand and killed this particular man and woman. And that is what we even add into our liturgical text today. Phinehasinte vaal എന്നൊക്കെ പറയുന്നത്, the sword of Phinehas. And this particular incident also gives rise to Phinehas as not just a priest, but as a leader as well. That later on, as we can read in Joshua chapter 22, Phinehas is sent to make compromises with Reuben, Gad, the half tribe of Manasseh, etc. And after that is when Reuben pleads on behalf of them. And you read in verse 25, the Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us and you, the Reubenites and the Gadites. So how that geographical line of the Jordan River creates a boundary. And you can read through Joshua chapter 22 to understand more about the plea of Phinehas that eventually ended the plague that was affecting this place. And they built an altar, not for burnt offerings or sacrifices, but rather as a witness. And even that is what we sing in our liturgy. For example, Aharondeയും Askaria Tannudeyum Doobamadum Maranate Nikia Finahasin Prarthanayale. Our Finahasinde Prarthana in the Parenada is a result of these particular facts that we just talked about, that has even come into our liturgical worship today. So we move on quickly owing to the concern of time. And the Israelites, they travel further up north, as you can see in this particular map. And let's move quickly into, my screens are jumping around. Right, let's move quickly into Deuteronomy chapter 34, where we read particularly about the death of Moses. And on the map on the right side, if you can see the Dead Sea, right to the right side of it, circled is Mount Nebo. So Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of the Pisgah across from Jericho. So that is where Moses climbs on Mount Nebo from Gilead. And the descriptions over there itself is clear to suffice. The land that he sees from Gilead, I think my red is again getting confused. Let me switch over into another color. Green, let's go for. Right, so Moses, the Lord shows him the whole land from Gilead to all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the land of the Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea, and the Negev, and the whole region of the valley of the Jordan. So you can see how God shows Moses pretty much everything 360 degrees around him. And for those of you who have visited these holy lands, this is the site from Mount Nebo that actually points to all the different places. Jericho, as you can see from this place, is not a long way off. Right in the middle of the screen, the fertile lands that you see ahead is the modern day city of Jericho, or as they call it, the city of palms. So, the crossing of the Jordan River in the Bible is pivotal. It is a very significant event symbolizing transition, symbolizing the divine promise, as well as new beginnings for the Israelites. In Joshua chapter 2 through to chapter 4, we read about the miraculous parting of the Jordan River to allow the Israelites to cross on dry ground, further emphasizing God's power and his direct involvement in their physical journey. The Jordan River forms a natural boundary of the promised land, and its crossing signifies the Israelites' claim to that land. And this particular event is not just that they crossed, but then the fact that every other kingdom around them knew of this particular incident. They were aware of this incident, probably because of the traveling traders, probably because of the different political connections at that time, but every other people knew about this. And an example of that is what we read about Joshua sending the spies to Jericho, and they meet Rahab, and how Rahab narrates to these spies saying, "We have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea. For when you came out of Egypt, what you did to Sihon and Og, the two Amorite kings east of the Jordan." So you see how it was absolutely crystal clear to everyone in the entire land about events that happened at particular geographical locations. So, this miraculous parting of the Jordan River obviously allows this Israelites to cross on the dry ground. And then they move towards Jericho, which is a highly fortified city at that time. And as you can see in these particular images shared here, the crossing site, which later on is quite close to the baptismal site of Jesus as well. And that crossing is quite significant because if you can see on the map, on the image on the right, at that point, they would have had to walk for around 2 miles. And for the water to have stopped, you're expecting a water depth of around 100 feet, which is around 30 meters. So people are walking with a wall of 30 meters of water around them. 30 meters of height is around a 5-story or a 6-story building. That's how high the water was. And the water, according to biblical narratives, backed all the way to the place called Adam, which is around 20 miles away from this crossing point. So you can see how significant this particular crossing itself would have affected the entire area. And that is how all the nations come to know about this great Israelite people who are crossing and coming into their land. Hmm? Oh. Interestingly, the word Hebrew literally means to cross over. Abraham crossed over from false gods to the one and only true God. He crossed over physically by leaving his homeland over into the promised land. The Israelites were delivered by God from the Egyptians as they crossed through the Red Sea and then crossed through the Jordan River into the promised land. And all these acts are pictures of deliverance and salvation. And if we were to think of it, we also cross over from death into life through Christ our Lord. So there's crossing over from Jordan, as you can see in the map, to Gilgal, which is the first place where they set camp before they went into Jericho and attacked Jericho. And Gilgal later on becomes very integral in the history of Israel, because obviously this is the place where the Israelites erected the monument of 12 stones, which were taken from the Jordan River. All the male children that were brought during the Exodus were circumcised at Gilgal. The first Passover in the Promised Land was celebrated at Gilgal. Gilgal was the site where later the Gibeonites tricked the Israelites into making a treaty, and we'll talk about that later. Gilgal was also the place where the prophet Samuel visited, as well as the place where Saul was made king. Elijah and Elisha, the prophets as well, traveled extensively through Gilgal. So you can see how this crossing over of the river Jordan into the place where they first set up the camp, Gilgal, essentially becomes a central point of Jewish history for a considerable number of years until the time of King David, where the significance moves into Jerusalem. And now, as you can see in this map that I have shared here, from Gilgal, let me try to annotate that again. Right, from Gilgal, they go on and capture Jericho. And then, as we read forward in the book of Numbers, they go on to capture Ai. And you might remember Ai from the story of Abraham, where we had the oak tree right at the middle of Ai and Bethel. But then we are told that they were defeated at Ai, and the defeat was because of a person called Achan or Achan, who had taken a few possessions and kept it with him. So then, when he is questioned, he admits to it, and eventually the Israelites take him down to the valley of Achor and stone him to death over there. They then go back to Ai and they conquer that land. And from there, they go all the way up to Mount Ebal. All the Israelites, with their elders, officials, judges, they were all standing on both sides of the ark of the covenant of the Lord, facing the Levite priests who carried it. And we are told that both foreigners living among them and native born people were there. So half the people stood on Mount Gerizim and half the people on Mount Ebal. And Moses, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had formally commanded them. And then this is where they make their covenant renewed. And then the deception of the people of Gibeah, as I had mentioned earlier. They had heard what was done to Jericho and what was done to Ai, and they make a treaty of peace with the people. But then, realizing that they had used deception, they are, well, we couldn't say that they were cursed, but then the Israelites later come to know about that. But eventually, the Gibeonites are integrated into the Jewish society. And this is a matter of note because even later on, at the time of Nehemiah, during the rebuilding of the temple, the Gibeonites were present to help them. But nonetheless, moving on, as we read through Joshua chapter 10 onwards, we understand that several kings, particularly 5 kings from that land, namely from Jebus, or the later name Jerusalem, from Hebron, from Jarmuth, from Lachish, and from Eglon. They came forward towards Gibeah or Gibeon because the Gibeonites had made a treaty with the Israelites. And they come to attack it. And the Gibeonites reach out to the Israelites at Gilgal, who then come to their rescue. Of course, we understand that the Israelites completely defeated all these kings at Gibeon, chasing them all the way up through the Beth Horon Ridge, all the way down to Makkedah. And this is where we read that the sun stood still, and the kings were killed in a cave at Makkedah. Now, the reason why this is significant is because effectively this brings the entire region under the control of the Israelites, enabling them to later divide it amongst the tribes. And if we read further in Joshua chapter 11, we can understand how the northern kingdoms as well were captured. But in the interest of time, I think we will move on from there. So you see how these geographical locations enable the building up of Israel as a country. So let's quickly jump into the book of Judges. And in the book of Judges in the Bible, it highlights a cycle of Israelite rebellion against God, oppression by their enemies, and deliverances by the judges. Now, these judges led Israel during a period between the death of Joshua and the establishment of the monarchy. So you're talking roughly around 1200 to 1000 BC or 900 BC. They delivered Israel from various enemies, but the book of Judges also highlights the Israelites' ongoing tension um, between the people of Canaan that was still remaining there, as well as their tendency towards idolatry and disobedience. And that's where the first chapter of the book of Judges comes into play, because it details the political situation which led into these particular idolatry situations. Now, in the book of Judges, there are at least 12 judges mentioned, but most of us will probably be familiar with at least six of them. And so I will only be talking about six of them that are underlined in the map of UC. The very first being Othniel from Judah. Now, the Israelites served Baal. Baal was again the Canaanite storm god associated with kingship, as well as Asherah, again, a Canaanite mother goddess linked with fertility, motherhood, and the cycle of life. And it is the influence of these Canaanite people that causes the Israelites to worship Baal and Asherah. Now, we are told that in the book of Judges, chapter 2, that the Israelites were conquered by Hushan Rishathim, who was the king from Aram Nahairim, that would have been a Mesopotamian region, who comes again, would have been along the trade routes. And he comes and captures them, and all these events, particularly concerning Othniel, take place at Debir, which is in the Judah region. And Othniel, who is the son of Kenaz, who is Caleb's younger brother, delivers them. And then they have peace for 40 years. And then later on, as we move through the book, we read of Ehud, who was in fact a Benjamite from Benjamin. And he was attacked by Eglon, the king of Moab, along with the Ammonites as well as the Amalekites. They formed a union and they attacked Israel at Benjamin. Now, Ehud went to Eglon, and that story is quite hilarious in the Bible. It's, I believe Eglon is the only person who is called a fat man in the Bible. The Bible specifically says he was a fat man. Anyway, Ehud goes to Eglon, has a large double-edged sword hidden with him, and then he goes on and kills Eglon. And then he returns after reaching Gilgal back into Moab to kill Eglon. Of course, then Israel attacked the hill country from Ephraim, is what we read in the biblical narratives. So after each of these judges, there was a period of peace. After Othniel, there was peace for around 40 years. After Ehud, there was peace for around 80 years. And then, according to biblical chronology, we move into Deborah. Now, particularly for Deborah, it is told that she was a prophetess who held court or acted as a judge. In fact, the place where she sat is called the Palm of Deborah. Probably there was a palm tree there under which she sat, and so it's called the Palm of Deborah. And it is in between Ramah and Bethel. So right about there. Now, Jabin, the king of Canaan, attacked And Deborah seeks assistance from the men of Naphtali and Zebulun. So you can see how the kingdom is united, that even before the time of kings, judges, as in a woman, Deborah, would have been able to seek the assistance of people miles away in Naphtali and Zebulun. And they obviously come and assist the Israelites and defeat the king of Canaan. And after that, again, we have a period of peace for around 40 years. That then goes into the story of Gideon. Gideon, as most of you may be more familiar than Othniel or Ehud, lived in close to the River Jordan area, because we are told that they were attacked by the Midianites, the Amalekites, and other eastern people, eastern referring to east of the River Jordan. And when they faced periods of shortages, they would straight away cross the River Jordan, come into this particular area and steal from them all the crops and ruin it. So they crossed over the River Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. But we know the story of Gideon and how they gained back the territory from the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the other eastern people. Again, peace ensues for over 40 years. And then the next judge about whom more details are told is Jephthah. Now, Jephthah was the only judge, the only major judge, if you will, east of the River Jordan. And again, he faced trouble from the Ammonites. And in Judges chapter 11 to 12, we read about how he recounts all the Exodus tales about Edom and how they had to come around, and then Moab, and then they were attacked, and all those things. And eventually they overcome Ammon as well. Now, Jephthah is from Gilead as such, but you may be familiar with Jephthah because of the incident concerning his daughter, where he promises to God that if he were to get victory, when he comes back home, whatever comes out of his house first, he will sacrifice to God. Unfortunately, it's his daughter that comes out of the house, and he goes on and sacrifices his daughter. But then, of course, the daughter asks for 4 days to roam around in the highlands. And you will remember the highlands, as we talked about earlier, during the time of Joseph going to search his brothers in the highlands at Dothan. And this is apparently even celebrated, well, in biblical times as a commemoration of the daughter of Jephthah, the Gileadites. And then, of course, you are all familiar with our very own Samson. And Samson faced trouble from the Philistines. And none be told more stories about Samson because you are all aware of it. That brings us to the end of the era of the judges. And then we have tales in between, such as those of Ruth and Naomi, who you know made that very strenuous journey from Moab all the way into Bethlehem. I think I will conclude this particular session at this point, because the next point would be moving on into the kings. And it is my hope that we would cover the kings and the prophets in our next session and conclude this particular series with the end of the Old Testament. Hopefully, if there is another opportunity for another series, we can move into the New Testament at that point of time. But once again, thank you all for very patiently listening. If at all there are any questions, I would seek to and attempt to try to answer them. But once again, let me conclude by highlighting that the geography of these places, as I have just walked through all the way from the Exodus up into the time of the Judges, plays a significant role in the story of the Israelites' growth as a nation and as the people of God. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Achan, for that insightful session. We will now move to the Q&A segment. Kindly keep your questions relevant to the theme of biblical geography. You can type your questions in the chat or unmute yourself and ask directly. Let us make this an engaging and meaningful discussion.
Rachel here. I would like to know if there are still followers of Baal and Asherah.
That is indeed a very good question. I would actually have to read into it. Unfortunately, since the Canaanites were later on overhauled by the Hellenistic Empire, the Greco Empire, and then later on by the Romans, the cultures would have changed, times would have changed. So the Canaanites, as such, narrow down, and this is again taking into account the exile into Assyria, the exile into Babylon, and the return, etc. Undoubtedly, there would have been followers, at least in biblical times, but they would not have been so great. We learn about worship places such as those claimed by the Samaritans, but then those would have been under the influence of Babylon directly. So for your question of whether there are followers of Baal and Asherah, I would have to apologize. I'd have to read into it and learn more about it. But I'll hope to get the answer for the next session for you.
Another question is there any particular place where the Israelites started getting manna? Or right from the beginning they had?
So the receipt of manna as such was as a response to the complaints that the Israelites made to God Almighty. Again, for a particular placing of that, I would have to refer it again. But I'm sure that might be a straightforward answer if we were to look. It is certainly within the wilderness on the northern part of it, because as they walked up from the wilderness of Sinai into the wilderness of Paran, but yes, I can only guess it would have been anywhere between Sinai and the upper regions, probably Paran or Elim for that fact. But certainly before they reached Kadesh Barnea. So that would be somewhere around the midpoint of the wilderness of Sinai and the wilderness of Paran.
Thank you, Achan. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. Thank you.
Just, I just did through ChatGPT. It says in the wilderness of sin is first Israelites have received the manna as per the book of Exodus.
The wilderness of sin. Okay.
Sin. So it says that as per ChatGPT in the book of Exodus, that's where Israelites have received first manna in the wilderness of sin, SIN, as recorded in the book of Exodus.
Okay, that would certainly be the northern part of Mount Sinai, which would be the wilderness of Sinai. And I'm assuming that the answer would have also made mention of Elim somewhere around the way.
Yeah.
Does it?
Yeah, but I think in your last session you had shown that place, no? Sin, a particular place was there in the map.
Yes, the wilderness of sin, which is
Sin.
between Sinai and Paran.
It says Exodus 16, 1-3, when Israelites complain of hunger, that is where 4 and 5, Exodus 16, 4 and 5 is where God delivers, gives the.
Yeah, likely a place within that Sinai Peninsula, the whole thing. But particularly, I'm assuming it would have been close to Elim, because that is the possibilities that would have come. After that, then they move further up to Kadesh Barnea. And that isn't a long period that they stay over there, because they send the spies and then quickly move on to Edom. So the period of complaining would have been prior to that. Yes.
There is one question in the chat box. Can I read the question?
Yes, please.
Is there a parallelism between the crossing of Jordan and the Israelites reaffirming their covenant with God after crossing and the baptism of Jesus?
Well, certainly there is a parallel drawn to that. Other spiritual lessons in the Karnam, as I had mentioned earlier, the crossing of Jordan is always considered as a period of cleansing, a period of renewal, etc. So it is from the wilderness into the land flowing with milk and honey. And in effect, that is our spirituality as well, from the wilderness of sin into the milk and honey of salvation. So definitely there is a direct parallel that is drawn between it.
Just sorry, we have Stephanos Tirmeni joining us. Tirmeni.
Really?
Yeah. Tirmeni, are you able to hear us, Tirmeni? Because it looks like Tirmeni just joined us.
I think Tirmeni is currently in a location where he has poor.
Is it? Okay, then it's fine.
Poor network connectivity, so I think he would be communicating via chat, if at all. But
okay, sure. Thank you, Tirmeni, for joining us. Okay. Any more questions? Okay.
So if there are no other questions, we can close this. Thank you everyone for your active participation in the Q&A session. To conclude this blessed gathering, I now request Achin to say the closing prayer.
സ്തോത്രം കർത്താവേ, സ്തോത്രമതായിരമായിരമായി അനവധിയായി സ്തോത്രം നാഥ, കൃപ വേണം ഞങ്ങളിലെന്നും. May the love of God the Father, the grace of the only begotten Son, and the communion and indwelling of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.